Sunlight glints off General Thompson's medals as a police officer's tongue, inches from her face, wags like a dog's. His colleague's laughter rings in the humid air. "Just a joke, General," he sneers. But behind Maya's impassive gaze, fury simmers. The cameras, unseen by the officers, are already rolling, capturing not just the insult, but the coming storm. The line between law and chaos blurred forever. And what unfolded next was more shocking than any courtroom drama or battlefield twist. If you believe in truth, justice, the power of standing tall against humiliation, then this story will grip your soul. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because every word ahead is going to challenge what you thought you knew about courage, betrayal, and the price of disrespect. The sun was high over the courthouse steps, and the day seemed ordinary until the moment had decorated. Black U.S. military general named Maya Thompson found herself face to face with a group of laughing police officers who thought it amusing to mock her in public. And one officer in particular stepped forward, sticking out his tongue inches from her face, while his colleagues snickered like it was a game. But Maya did not flinch. She stood calm, her green uniform lined with metal shining in the daylight, her eyes fixed on him with the discipline of someone who had faced real battles in deserts and jungles where lives were on the line, and not childish arrogance. Yet deep inside, she felt the sting of insult sharper than any bullet. Because this was not only disrespect toward her, but toward the flag she carried and the men and women who had sacrificed everything under her command. The crowd around them shifted uneasily. Phones came out to record. Some gasped at the audacity, others whispered in anger, and among them a few veterans clenched their fists as they watched a police officer dishonor a soldier who had bled for her country. But Maya remained still, her composure, a shield stronger than armor, because she knew one thing. Every insult, every act of disrespect left behind evidence. And already the eyes of the nation were watching through cameras and whispers, waiting to see how she would respond. The officer smirked, leaning closer to provoke a reaction. But she answered only with silence and a steady gaze. The kind of gaze that had silenced soldiers in training camps and enemies on the battlefield. And just when the laughter seemed to rise louder, the heavy courthouse doors opened, and an unexpected figure emerged, General Richard Wallace, a retired legend whose presence alone carried authority. His sharp eyes took in the scene at once, his jaw set with the disappointment of a man who had given his life to service, and the murmurs of recognition from older veterans in the crowd began to ripple. His name spreading like fire, General Wallace, General Wallace. And with that, the arrogant smiles on the officers. Faces began to falter because they knew what the cameras had captured, and they knew that their mockery had awakened something much larger than their laughter. A conflict not of fists or bullets, but of dignity, honor, and justice. And for the first time, it was clear the real battle was only beginning. The air grew heavier around the courthouse steps as the crowd sensed that the mocking laughter of the police had crossed a line that could not be ignored. And General Maya Thompson stood unwavering, her silence now echoing louder than any shouted. Command, because restraint in the face of humiliation carried a weight. The officers did not understand, and their smirks began to fade when General Richard Wallace stepped closer. His presence radiating the authority of decades of service as decorated career, etched into every wrinkle on his face and every stride in his step. And though retired, his voice still carried the power of command as he told the officers that mocking a soldier who had risked her life for the nation was not only shameful, but a betrayal of every value the badge was meant to represent. The words silenced some in the crowd, but fueled others into loud agreement chants rising from veterans and civilians alike, demanding respect for Maya, demanding accountability for the police. And yet the mocking officer stubbornly clung to arrogance, declaring that soldiers could not hide behind their uniforms and that cops on the streets held more power than any general. But his words only revealed his ignorance, because Maya had endured battles where power was not about guns or badges, but about moral strength and sacrifice. And though she still refused to raise her voice, the fire in her eyes grew brighter, the kind of fire that once rallied soldiers to charge through enemy lines, and the cameras caught capturing not only her restraint, but also the arrogance of the officers. And already those recordings were racing across social media, spreading like wildfire, as hashtags began to trend, calling out the police and demanding justice. And inside the courthouse, whispers reached the ears of officials, judges, and lawyers who stepped to the windows to watch the drama unfold. Their expressions turning grave as they realized the confrontation outside was no longer a small scene, but a spark that could ignite the whole city. Yet Maya stood firm. From her back straight, her silence strategic, because she understood better than anyone that battles are not always won by charging first. Sometimes they are won by letting the enemy expose his weakness, and the officer had done exactly that, while the nation now watched in outrage and awe. And General Wallace, leaning slightly toward Maya, murmured words only she could hear, reminding her that dignity was her greatest weapon, and the reckoning for those who mocked her had only just begun. The crowd outside the courthouse had swelled to nearly double its size by the time the tension reached its breaking point, and every eye remained fixed on General Maya Thompson and the arrogant officer who had mocked her, because the moment had shifted from a minor act of disrespect to a public spectacle that carried the weight of national attention. And the videos that had already gone viral were now being replayed on television screens in nearby shops, where anchors spoke urgently about the unfolding clash between law enforcement and military honor. And Maya felt the storm building around her, but she did not flinch, because she knew this was no longer about her pride alone. It was about a symbol, about every soldier who had stood in harm's way, believing their service was respected at home. And yet, watching these officers laugh as though her medals meant nothing threatened to unravel that sacred belief, and the crowd's chants grew louder, calling out the officers, demanding. They apologized, demanding accountability, but instead the mocking cop puffed up his chest, emboldened by his own arrogance, and shouted that generals lived in glory while cops carried the real burdens of the street, a statement that drew some nods but far more jeers. And Maya finally stepped forward, her boots striking the courthouse stone like a drumbeat, silencing the noise, not with volume, but with presence, as she spoke for the first time with a calm voice that carried the tone of authority, sharpened by decades of command, reminding the officers and the crowd that soldiers bleed in deserts and jungles so that cities can sleep in peace, and that mocking a soldier was not bravery, but cowardice disguised as humor. Her words struck the crowd like a spark, and cheers erupted. Veterans raised their caps. Civilians clapped and shouted while the officers looked shaken. But the arrogant one tried again to laugh it off, until General Richard Wallace raised his voice's old but commanding tone, reminding the officers that their badges meant protection, not mockery, and that if they could not honor the very uniform that guaranteed their freedoms, they had no business wearing one themselves. The weight of his words pressed down like a hammer, and for a flicker of a moment, the arrogant officer's eyes shifted nervously to the cameras, realizing too late that the nation had already judged him. And then the unexpected happened. From the courthouse doors emerged a high-ranking judge flanked by security, who declared loudly enough for all to hear that the footage had been reviewed and an immediate internal investigation into the conduct of the officers was being launched on the spot. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the reality sank, and the mockery had now turned into a scandal. And Maya's silent endurance had become the turning point in a storm that would soon bring consequences greater than any of the officers had ever imagined. And as the crowd roared louder with approval, Maya felt the shift within herself too. The battle was no longer hers. Alone, it was a fight for respect, justice, and dignity. And she was prepared to see it through, no matter how deep the storm raged. The courthouse steps had become the epicenter of a storm that stretched far beyond the city. And as the chants of the swelling crowd echoed through the streets, General Maya Thompson stood unwavering, her medals glinting under the afternoon sun, while the arrogant officer who had mocked her now shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes and millions, more watching through the cameras, because the investigation announced by the judge had instantly elevated this clash into a national crisis, and news vans screeched into position, broadcasting live reports as anchors, described the shocking disrespect shown to a decorated general and the calm, dignified way she had held her ground. And across the country, veterans poured into streets demanding respect for their service, while officials in Washington scrambled to respond to the uproar. But the true climax unfolded still on those courthouse steps, because the officer attempted to defend himself, his voice rising angrily as he shouted that he had only been joking, and that the general was overreacting. But his words fell flat against the roar of disapproval from the crowd. And then Maya finally moved forward one deliberate step after another until she stood directly before him, her gaze sharp, unyielding, and filled with the weight of every battle she had survived. And in a voice steady yet cutting, she told him that mocking the soldier was not a joke. It was a stain upon the very oath he had sworn as an officer of the law, and that while she had faced enemies overseas, she had never expected such betrayal from those sworn to protect the same flag. She defended her words, pierced the silence. The crowd held its breath, and then erupted in thunderous cheers. The sound drowning the officer's protest, and the judge, who had remained nearby, raised a hand signaling for order before declaring that the officer and his colleagues would be removed from duty pending the full investigation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the ranks of police present, and some lowered their heads in shame. Others stepped back, visibly shaken by the consequences now looming over them. And Maya, though outwardly calm, felt the surge of vindication, not for herself alone, but for every soldier whose sacrifice demanded respect. And as the crowd erupted again with chants of her name, veterans saluting her civilians, holding their phones high to capture the moment, General Richard Wallace stepped to her side, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, his eyes glistening with pride, as he whispered that history would remember not the insult, but her restraint, her dignity, and her courage in standing. Tall without striking back, and with that the confrontation ended. Not with fists or violence, but with the triumph of honor over arrogance. And as Maya turned to leave the courthouse steps, the cameras followed her every move, immortalizing the image of a general who had endured insult and transformed it into a national reckoning, proving once again that true strength is not in loud defiance, but in calm, unwavering resolve. And as the day came to a close, the nation understood that respect is not given to the uniform alone, but to the spirit of sacrifice that lives within it. And the legacy of that moment would echo far beyond the courthouse steps into the very soul of America and beyond.